Um pequeno país em guerra constante, com menos de 21 mil quilômetros quadrados, uma população de 7 milhões e meio de habitantes, que caberia entre Rio e São Paulo, tem mais empresas iniciantes de alta tecnologia que os Estados Unidos ou a China. Tem mais empresas de capital de risco, as chamadas Ventures Capital, que qualquer outro país. E também lucra mais, proporcionalmente, com a exportação de alta tecnologia. O jornalista Saul Singer publicou o livro Nação Empreendedora para tentar explicar esse fenômeno. Vamos saber qual é. Saul, how do you explain all this number of startups, companies, and this concentration of venture capital in Israel?
Well, the big part of the answer is that Israel itself is a startup nation. It had to be like a startup to exist at all. Israel had to deal with all kinds of adversity throughout its history, from being a very small country, from being shut off from the regional market, being under attack, many different forms of adversity, lack of resources, and so on. This forced Israel to be innovative, and to be very determined and to take risks, which is very much the heart of doing startups. So if Israel itself weren't doing these things, then Israel wouldn't be there. So it's part of the atmosphere, it's part of the culture to take risks and to be very determined and get things done.
Could you tell us some Israeli developed technology currently in use around the world?
Well, there are lots of things. If you look, say, in almost any computer, there are chips developed by Intel. Most of the chips were either designed or built in Israel or both. The Centrino, the Pentium, the first chip in the first IBM PC was designed in Israel. The disk-on-key was invented in Israel. Voicemail, all kinds of things like when you start putting in a search in Google and it starts making suggestions for you, that was developed in Israel. A lot of things that people use in their daily lives, in their mobile phones and the internet, they don't realize it, but they come from Israel.
You said in your book that de Gaulle, the former French president, and the Arab boycott were responsible for the Israeli technological success. Why?
Well, de Gaulle imposed a boycott on Israel of military assistance. Israel before that was relying very much on French weapons and Air Force and so on. And when it was cut off overnight, Israel had to develop its own industry based on technology, started developing its own aircraft, and that was the beginning of high-tech in Israel, though right now high-tech is not mainly from the military. It's independent of the military, but the first thing that happened was it grew up in the military.
But Army has an important role in the development of high technology in Israel. I would like you to explain that role.
That's right. The impact of the military is not so much technology that's built in the military and becomes startups. It's more the cultural impact, since almost every Israeli goes through the military. They get a tremendous experience in terms of leadership, teamwork. They learn what a mission is, how to be very determined, how to take risks, how to improvise, because the Israeli military, unlike other militaries, forces you to be more creative, to improvise, because it's a small military, and the only way it could defend Israel against much larger armies was to have better technology and to be more innovative.
But in the other side, Army has a very strong impact in among youth in Israel. Some people very much negative impacted too.
Well, Israelis don't like to go to the military like any young people. It's not surprising that most Israelis wish they didn't have to spend 2 or 3 years of their lives in the military. But the experience they get there is very important for their lives. It's a different experience than they get in school or in business. They learn things like they learn to sacrifice for something larger than themselves. That's very important. There's a lot of things you learn You become more mature compared to going to university. If you go to the military and then you go to the university, when you start studying, you're more mature and you get more out of it. So that's what's happened to Israelis.
But there was a very important program to develop the startups in Israel. It was the YOSMA program, right? I would like you to explain how did the YOSMA worked and what are the main pillars of this program?
Yes, it was a government program in the mid-1990s that came at a critical point. And what it did is it jump-started the venture capital industry. Before that, there wasn't really much venture capital at all in Israel. And what it was is the government put in money for funds. The private sector, the Israeli private sector funds were also partners, as well as American venture capital funds. It was a three-way partnership, and the government helped take some of the risk. So it was very attractive to the private funds, and it was very successful. So successful that the private venture capital funds ended up buying out the government position, and now it's basically all private. So the government started the process, but then was able to get out of it.
And how much money the government put in this YOSMA program?
It was not that much. It was in the order of $100 million. It really was not very much, but the venture capital industry grew very much after that because all these startups started coming up. It came at just the right moment. And there are other things that happened at that time. The Oslo peace process in 1993 was helpful. The Russian immigration, 1 million Russians came from the former Soviet Union to Israel over 10 years.
Specialized scientists, all professors.
Many of them engineers, many of them were civil and mechanical engineers, and they were retrained in Israel to become electronic and computer engineers, and that program paid for itself many, many times over.
What's the numbers nowadays of startups and venture capital in Israel?
Well, every year, say all of Europe produces about 600-700 startups. In Israel, we produce about 500 every year. Startups. There are about 3,000-4,000 at any given time in Israel, high-tech startups. And then there's also many research and development centers. Big companies like IBM, Cisco, Microsoft, Google have very big centers in Israel. For instance, Google, in 2007 they started with 17 people. Now they're about to have 200 people. It's probably one of the fastest growing offices of Google in the world. And this is what a lot of mainly American companies have been doing, but I think it's a very exciting possibility to have more companies from other parts of the world do the same thing in Israel.
But Hewlett-Packard, I think, was the pioneer, right? It was a director who is Jewish and decided to move some equipments to. How did it happen?
Well, Hewlett-Packard was important. They bought a major Israeli company, but I think Intel was even earlier. And Intel was the pioneer in a way. Actually, if you look at Silicon Valley, a lot of people say Hewlett-Packard was the first company to help create Silicon Valley. For Israel, it was probably Intel, because they came very early on, and they became one of the biggest employers in all of Israel. And they started building chips and designing chips there. It was their first development center outside the United States, and became very, very important for the company.
And Intel had links with the Jewish community too?
Well, the person who started Intel Israel was an Israeli named Dov Froman, who was working in Intel in a very early stage. He started actually in Fairchild Computer before Intel. He invented in Intel one of the key products even before they started making computer chips for Intel. So he had a high status within Intel, and he said, I want to go back to Israel and start Intel in Israel. And at that time it was a crazy idea, because this was around 1977 when there was almost no high-tech in Israel. But Dov Froman was very influential in the company, so they let him do it. And the rest is history, as you can say.
And Israel, there's no Silicon Valley in Israel. Perhaps the universities are the Silicon Valley, right? Or how's this relation between Israeli universities and the companies, high-tech companies?
Well, it's a strong relationship, but like Silicon Valley had Hewlett-Packard and Stanford University were the core things at the beginning of Silicon Valley. You have the same thing in Israel, where you have very strong universities like Hebrew University, the Weizmann Institute, the Technion, were started in the 1920s, even before the state was established. Very far-sighted thinking, and they're a very important part of creating a startup nation.
Nós voltamos a falar com Saul Singer, autor de Nação Empreendedora, sobre as empresas de alta tecnologia em Israel. So the history of Israel is hardly replicable in other parts of the world, but perhaps the Yosman program can be replicable in a place like Brazil. Do you think so?
Yes, well, a lot of countries have been looking at the Yosman program to copy it. I think, though, a key thing to understand is that it doesn't help to just throw venture capital at a country. You have to be ready to absorb it. There have to be the entrepreneurs and the startups that are ready to start spending, that are worth investing in, because you can't just increase R&D spending and create startups out there. It actually sometimes goes the other way around, in the sense that there's a researcher at Harvard named Ricardo Hausman who told us that the reason Israel has such high R&D spending, 4.5% of GDP goes to R&D, is because we have so many startups. We're able to spend the R&D funding. And the same with venture capital. You have to have the startups in order to invest. So it's hard to know what to do first.
Yes. Here in Brazil, I don't know if you are familiar, we have a very heavy load of taxes. Mm-hmm. And so for a startup, perhaps is the same amount for already established company. Do you think it happens in Israel, for instance?
Well, the tax situation in Israel for startups is good. The taxes are relatively low on the taxes that are important to startups. Income taxes are high, but other taxes that affect startup are lower. And one of the advantages of the startup scene is that it's not dominated by one company. It's very competitive. It's a global market, so it's not heavily regulated, and that's been very helpful for the startups. Yeah,
you said in your book that to start a company is very difficult. So because somebody has a good idea and have to have a lot of stimulus to go on. Yes. With the idea and transform the idea in one thing, in one product, or this kind of thing. But do you think there's a lot of factors in Israel that push to the startups go on?
Yes, well, the same factors that created all this, I think, are continuing in Israel, in the sense that Israelis, it's considered a good thing to be an entrepreneur. It's a high-status occupation. It's something that people want to do. Not everybody can do it, obviously, but it's something that's respected, and it's also acceptable to take risks and to fail. That's very important, because most startups do fail, including in Israel. Whether in Silicon Valley or Israel, it's very risky. So you have to have support for failure. You have to have a lot of determination and drive, and you have to have a willingness to take risks. But I think that a lot of countries, they think, how can we do more startups? But in some ways, the real question is, how can we be more innovative? How can we be more global as a country or as a company? And I think what's happened is that Israel has really helped American companies do this, because the American companies have bought startups, they've started R&D centers, and I think the lesson from Israel is that other countries should do it. You know, like Brazil, like European countries, like Asian countries. It doesn't make sense that 80% of the direct investment in Israel come from the United States. It should also come from other countries, and so that other countries can benefit from this synergy between very small innovative companies and large companies that are good at scaling and are close to the markets.
And another thing you say in your book is there's something biblical of taking risks and accept failure. Can you explain us how this relation with the Bible and the high technology?
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things about Israelis is they like to debate and argue and to challenge, and they ask a lot of questions. They don't respect authority very much. And I think this comes from the Bible. If you look at the story of Abraham arguing with God in the Bible. And it's clear that, that Jews grow up with this story. And if they're going to argue, if they see Abraham arguing with God, they're of course willing to argue with the head of Intel or Microsoft or whoever. They don't worry so much about hierarchy and status. And
what about living in risk? How this drives to accept risk and accept risk in startups?
Well, living with risk is something kind of normal in Israel. We've had to face a lot of risk, and that's helped. I noticed that if you go to a kibbutz kindergarten, these small places in Israel, and it's remarkable, you look at the toys that they have in the back, and there's broken tractors and all kinds of sharp and rusty things. And in most countries, they wouldn't let kids play with these things. But in Israel, it's considered normal. You just, you're not too fussy about taking risks. It's the way it is.
So, do you think it helps to be innovative?
Yes.
Okay. And what's the weight of high technology on Israeli trade?
Well, about half of the economy is exports, and about half of the exports are high tech. So it's compared to most countries, high tech is a very important part of the economy. And it really is the driving force of the growth of the economy, which right now is growing, I think, the fastest in the OECD of any developed country.
And do you think the Jewish world community has a strong role in this, like helping Israel without expect any advantage, and so leave, for instance, this venture capital to go kind of looser than in other countries?
Well, I think that Israel has benefited from a large diaspora network of people, but if you look historically, a lot of Jewish businessmen or companies did not invest in Israel for many years, and in fact only started investing when other companies started doing so. I don't think it's been the key thing. I think the networking aspect is helpful, but it's not the main explanation for why Israel's been able to do so well in the world. I mean, one major thing that Israel is very good at is globalization, and that's not because Israelis are so brilliant. It's because the country is so small. Because every company that starts in Israel has to think already from day one about being global, because there's no local market to speak of. They're shut off from the regional market, so you have to think global.
And you said, too, that immigration has an important role to develop the startups. Could you explain us?
That's right. Almost everybody in Israel themselves immigrated, or their parents or their grandparents. It's a very young country, and many, many immigrants from 80 countries around the world. And I think that's contributed to this drive and determination and willingness to take risk, because that's a natural thing for immigrants. If you're willing to take the risk to move from one country to another, you're willing to take risks. And it also takes a lot of drive to move from one country to another. So these people are natural entrepreneurs. And you actually see in Silicon Valley as well that about half of the Silicon Valley startups were started by immigrants to the United States.
We see nowadays a big problem in Europe, in other countries too, to deal with immigration. Do you think it will be good for these countries to organize and to just welcome this kind of immigration for innovation?
Well, another thing, though, that Israel has done is worked very hard at what they call absorbing immigrants. And in fact, in Israel, there's a ministry of absorption. The whole job is to integrate immigrants into the society. And I think your countries have had more trouble with that. You have to. It's not enough to have immigrants. You also have to integrate them and include them and make sure they're part of the society. And if that happens, I think then you can have some of the economic benefits of immigration.
Do you have an idea of the weight of the army orders to the Israeli tech companies?
Well, most of the Israeli high-tech companies are not military or security related. There are some, but Israel is #1 in medical device patents in the world, very strong in clean tech, strong in internet, in mobile phones. Just recently at the big mobile phone conference in Barcelona, there were 50 Israeli companies at this one conference. So Israel is very strong in all kinds of agri-tech, water, all kinds of technologies. Part of it is security, but it's a small part.
You said in your book another interesting thing, that an Israeli is selling coffee to Brazil. Is it true?
That's true. The Strauss company, I understand, bought a Brazilian company and is working together with that company in Brazil to sell coffee here. And that
sounds like selling oil to Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. So this is, to me, this is a very good example of a different kind of export for Israel, where it's not just technology, because that's not a technology innovation, it's a business model innovation. And I think going forward that Israel is going to be doing more of this business model innovation. Another example is Better Place, the electric car system that's going to happen in Israel. Israel is going to be the first country to actually replace gas cars on a mass level. And Denmark is happening next, and Australia is happening after that. And this is basically not a technology innovation, but a business model innovation.
Very good. Thank you very much, Saul. Very nice talking to you.
Thank you.